This podcast is intended for entertainment and informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the business psychos and does not reflect the viewpoints of their current or former employers or clients. Thank you.
It's the business psychos, and today we're gonna talk it out. The podcast about what execs shouldn't talk about. Connecting executives and those who aspire. We're here to have a conversation, yeah, we're gonna light the fire. It's the business psychos. Yeah. The business psychos.
Welcome to Business Psychos, where we discuss how to navigate the complexity of corporate culture in modern life without becoming a psycho. I'm Mary.
I'm Katie.
And we are the Business Psychos. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Mary.
Before we start today, we received some comments from some of our listeners asking us to talk a bit more about our backgrounds and experience. You want to go first?
Yeah. So I just had this conversation last week. I had dinner with my Eli Lilly bestie, Siobhan, from back in the day when I was a pharmaceutical rep. And she's still in the industry, and my career has diverged pretty dramatically from when we'd known each other. So I went through a bit of this chronology. So for me, the headline is that for the last close to 20 years in the career parts of my life, I've built revenue, aka sales, and customer success teams for early stage tech companies. And 3 times the companies that I have built teams in and organizations in have gone on to either become publicly listed and or reach billion-dollar valuation. I'm proud to have been part of some really phenomenal groups. My niche is that I tend to build from the ground up, meaning there's no organization or infrastructure in place. This involves figuring out the value proposition. So how and who we sell to, our processes, our operations, hiring, comp plans, building the leadership org, which also includes ideal individual contributors in which roles make sense for what we're doing, the management layer, and more senior leaders, along with training and development, lead generation, and scaling and optimization. My quantum leap from pharmaceutical or the medical space was that I was working as an individual contributor for a medical device company, and the wife of the co-founder and CEO of the first tech company I worked at recommended me to her husband, conceivably because of how I was approaching my role. I was doing a lot of analytics. So I was doing a lot of figuring out how to optimize. I was working very hard. With that said, what I loved about the work that I've done in my career has been the human component. The revenue results have been essential, but in many ways secondary to what gives me energy around the work. I've been really lucky because I've worked with brilliant founders and extraordinary people. So Mary, let me pass the mic back to you.
Yeah, the elevator line is I like to build, grow, and fix things. I started my career in the digital and operations space. I started off at NYU and then Tiffany and Company. And I would say I've spent most of, 25 going on 30 years in management consulting. First at Oliver Wyman and later at Boston Consulting Group. I've also held executive roles at large banks where I focused on strategy and change management. I founded M. Schaub Advisory and am grateful to now spend my time supporting senior executives with their transformation work. I'm also a freelance writer, and I have a few projects that I'm hoping I'll be able to share at some point later this year or early next.
What an extraordinary career you've had. I mean, just every single name is recognizable, and the impact that you've had in those organizations is absolutely incredible.
Well, your stats are equally exciting, and I think what you've talked about before, and we've talked offline about this, is we both have very unique experiences in the workforce and as leaders, and I think that's really important right now because there's so many people who care about these issues but it has a slightly different flavor if you're in a tech startup or if you're in a 200,000 person organization, and that workforce is changing. So good insights.
Yeah, and I think for both of us, we came up from very unconventional paths into the organizations and the functions that we performed in. And I think that has also maybe informed a lot of the commonality we have in terms of the empathy and the perspective that we have that's very similar, even though the types of organizations we've been in has been very different.
100%. Okay, I want to shift gears and indulge myself a little bit. And I want to ask you, what's new? What have you seen, heard, read, watched? I have something I'm really excited to talk about.
So upon your recommendation, I did a deep dive into Netflix. Once I had completely exhausted your recommendation, in very short order, by the way, I found a show called The Program about these high discipline behavior control schools. They're not really schools. I'm so riveted by coercion and these types of environments where it's like group traumatization. I actually watched it 2 times. There's 3 episodes, and I was just riveted. It was called The Program. It's on Netflix.
Okay.
How about you?
I'm putting that on the list. I love, as you know, I have like all of my recommendations on a Trello board, and I guess I'm talking about what everyone's talking about, which is Baby Reindeer on Netflix. And my wonderful friend and friend of the show, Mario, recommended it, and I'm so grateful that he did. It's so intense, but also unique and really psychologically complex. And it stars and it was written by Richard Gadd. And I had no idea until I was halfway into it that he's actually playing himself in the show. I knew that it was based on, real experiences, but I had no idea that was him. I don't want to say anything more than that. If you know, you know. If you don't, and you like things which pack an emotional punch, check it out. But this to me is like the proverbial like water cooler show that you watch it and you just feel like you have to talk to somebody the next day and like, what is it that I just experienced?
You're not doing any spoilers?
No, I would. Oh my God. I hate people who spoil things. And it's so, all I'll say is he's a struggling comedian. And I've talked about comedians before on the show. I love comedians. Just when you think you have it under, you completely understand what's going on, it has another twist and turn. It's one of those limited series. It's bingeable, but actually, I don't know if I could binge that because I couldn't, like, I needed a break. I needed some cartoons and some cereal before bed after watching that. I was like, I needed like a palate cleanser.
Yeah, understandably. I chewed through it. But it is, as far as writing is concerned and structuring, it's really
character development.
And also how it's structured in terms of like building the plot. That was pretty. That's pretty unusual right now. I feel like a lot of writing does a lot of sort of cheap shots to just kind of keep the plot going. But this really continued to build. So anyway, highly, highly appreciate the recommendation.
Well, and thank you for yours. I'll add that to the list. So on to today's topic. This is another, I think, important and timely one. And it's the first show we're doing at our listeners' request, which I think is kind of cool. So when we come back, we're going to talk about ageism. Next on Business Psychos. Okay, we are back talking about ageism today. Like everything we talk about here, this is a complex issue which we aren't going to fully unpack in 30 minutes. Let's start with the definition of ageism. It's prejudice or discrimination on the grounds of someone's age. In 1967, the U.S. Age Discrimination Employment Act was established. It prohibits discrimination in hiring, promotion, discharge, compensation, job training, as well as harassment and hostile behaviors due to age. Okay, so this is important though. For our discussion today, we're going to be focusing on discrimination of older workers. And I say this because the US law I just mentioned only covers workers over 40 years old. This means it is currently legal to discriminate against US workers under 40 due to their age, which I found really, really interesting. And I would love to hear viewpoints from our under 40 listeners on whether you have seen this or felt it, or if you have any unique perspectives, and maybe we'll do another topic to cover it in the future. The majority of the baby boomer generation are still in the workforce and are generally postponing retirement. And this is a really big change compared to prior generations. The U.S. Bureau of Labor projects that the number of older folks in the workforce is going to increase over the next decade, with adults over 65 comprising almost 9% of the labor force by 2032. I'm a very visual person. As I was taking in all these statistics and doing this research, the workforce used to look like a triangle with the oldest workers on the top. Now, because the boomer generation isn't retiring, it's actually more like a square. And it helps me think about the context here. So there are about 1 million folks over 55 who are unemployed. Most of these are what's called long-term unemployed, which means you've been looking for a job for more than 27 weeks. The AARP, and if you're not familiar with that, that's the American Association of Retired Persons, notes that more than a quarter of those million unemployed have been denied a job due to their age. Even those who have jobs are reporting feeling ageism. 78% of employed Americans, that's huge, that's like 80%, Katie. 80%, almost 80% of employed Americans between the ages of 40 and 65 are saying that they've seen or experienced ageism. And nearly half of those have felt it in the last 3 years.
It really strikes me as this kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't dividing line of 40 years old. And I'm really glad that you pointed out the importance of age-related discrimination earlier in your career, because in the early stage of your career, it's really emphasized how you don't have enough experience. In the later stage of your career, it's emphasized that you really have too much, and now whatever experience you have is irrelevant. So, I mean, back to the damned if you do, damned if you don't. In the U.S., the average age to start working is between 20 and 25 years old. And the federal protections against age-based discrimination apply to 40 years and older. So this is meaningful to everyone. I mean, regardless of your current age, because if you start working at 25, there's only 15 years of being not too old versus the 25 years from 40 to 65. It's coming for everyone. I've observed there tends to be that kind of like split at the 40 line. And, when thinking about this episode, I thought about, even like what it means to be qualified. Like skills are less valuable than understanding the longer term implications on time with themes, like the impacts of certain shortcuts or seeing signals in the org and knowing what will happen if corrective action isn't taken. I mean, arguably skills age out a bit. And knowing how to use new software, understanding cultural trends, if these are things that are meaningful for the business, need to constantly be updated. But being curious, open to learning, not afraid to look stupid. And this goes back to our overachievement episode, and it benefits people on both sides of this divide. But I've seen a sort of a generational standoff with younger folks feeling unproven and anxious, and older folks feeling or fearing being irrelevant. When those defenses get heightened, these positions become more divisive. I've seen they're so selfish, I can't believe that they don't get it on one side of the age divide, and then, they're so clueless on the other. Part of the wisdom of the experience is being able to remember the process of learning and maintaining a level of empathy when you're working with younger people is to understand what it's like to go through those phases. Thinking about those 1 million unemployed Americans that are 55 and older, I mean, they're going to be particularly devastated coming out of the peak earning years, like their 40s and early 50s. Since these folks are staying unemployed longer, it really can impact their financial status as well as self-confidence and mental health, which is a compounding issue. So often qualified and experienced job seekers will be ghosted by recruiters, and many either take gig work to supplement their income or are forced to take, lower level and lower paying jobs, which can also dramatically undermine self-confidence.
Oh, it's so demoralizing. You're a leader. You've reached a certain point in your career, and you have a title and a role, and then like you're starting to evaluate whether you need to do gig work to even make ends meet. And often this is due to just consolidation and like downsizing, right? We're not talking about someone who messed up and got laid off. This is one of those, okay, we need to start to cut heads, and some of these folks are included. I have a friend of mine who's a corporate lawyer who was displaced last year, and he's been searching for a job since and still inconceivably to me, unable to find a role at the same level and salary as the one he was just downsized from. So he told me that he's starting to interview for more junior roles just out of necessity. And while he was interviewing for one of these smaller jobs, the recruiter actually asked him why someone with his experience would be interested in the role. It kind of goes to the point you just said, Katie, right? The damned if you do and damned if you don't. And to me, it felt like a really clever, maybe even somewhat manipulative way of masking ageism and turning the tables to use experience against a qualified candidate. Think about this, and why are organizations doing this? Why does ageism exist in the workplace? And my sense is that the main reason is around senior role scarcity. As you just said, Katie, those folks have reached their peak earning years. And if they've been at an organization for a few years, they're kind of compounding, their bonus and their salary, right? They're doing pretty well financially. Most organizations have a hierarchy, back to our triangle with the most senior, highest paying jobs on top. That's how much most workforce models operate. But as I mentioned earlier, the workforce age demographics have changed. So it's no longer a triangle. If you think maybe, 20, 30, 40 years ago, the age and the corporate hierarchy sort of jived. It all lined up. But now, since boomers aren't retiring and folks are working longer, you have that square workforce with the triangle overlay. So the competition for top jobs is greater because more people are staying in the workforce longer. And you and I were joking around last week, Katie, about musical chairs, that analogy. If folks aren't retiring, you have more people playing for fewer chairs. So if you happen to get booted from your organization, you now have lost a key advantage. It's going to be harder to get into a brand new organization at a senior level because there's a whole bunch of folks like you there that are competing for those jobs. And the next issue, which I think ties into my friend's recruiting experience, is cultural bias. This was a really disturbing note that I found, is that some hiring managers and recruiters report feeling uncomfortable hiring older people due to what they call cultural fit. We'll use my little air quotes there. In my mind, this is antiquated thinking and really just a form of prejudice. Like, I once had an open role in my team, and my manager wanted to be part of the interview panel, so it was fine. And we interviewed a wonderful woman who I'm thinking now was probably in her mid-50s. She had a very successful career and had done some independent work. And during that time, her kids, she had an empty nest. Her kids went off to college and then they moved out. And she decided to apply to my open role. So she was, I would say, if you were looking at her resume to the role, you might say this person seems a little overqualified for her experience. And I didn't ask about her personal situation. She had actually shared it, and it made a lot of sense to me. And then my manager suggested we eliminate her from the first round. because she was concerned the candidate wouldn't be a fit for the rest of the team whose age skewed younger. I eventually pressed for her to be hired, and she ended up doing very well and even played a mentorship role to others in the group, which frankly helped me. I was really stunned. I was wondering to myself, like, what cultural harm is an older person going to bring to a team? What's the downside? Is she going to annoy people by talking about her middle-aged hobbies? Like, sorry, Angela, we can't have any of that bird watching talk around here. You're upsetting the kids. That one's me. And then I think the last bias, which might be grounded in some reality, is adaptability, including skills development, which you just touched on. Here's a really disturbing statistic. Only 13% of hiring managers say they would consider hiring someone 55 or over, even if they were qualified for the job. So that's just like, no, I'm not going to. Can you imagine for any other demographic just being like, I don't care if you're qualified, just based on your age? They report being concerned that the older people won't have, wait for it, a growth mindset. And then, shout out, we just dropped episode 4 on growth mindset. If you want to know what this term is code for, they say they're concerned that these older folks will be comfortable staying up to date with learning new skills. And so, Katie, I don't know about you. This could be true, and I have seen it on an individual basis. You do come across people, regardless of their age, who don't want to learn anything new. But unilaterally excluding candidates due to their age because of a non-substantiated stereotype is just discrimination.
Yeah, lack of receptivity to learn things knows no demographic barrier. That's
a uniting characteristic. Yeah. It brings us all together.
It crosses all demographics, ages, protected classes. Yeah, I had a similar experience to the one you just described. For so-called culture fit, I create organizational rubrics, which are clearly defined values for every organization. Part of my discovery process about what really makes somebody a fit, pulling out the things like curiosity, team player, self-awareness, ethical, strong work ethic, communication skills, organized, sense of urgency, with a rating scale and a way to assess it. And to claim a candidate is not a culture fit, your case needs to be applied to those values. Similar to your experience, I had a hiring manager tell me a candidate who had done really well in the interviewing process was not a fit for his organization. Similar story, it was a young, fun group. My response at the time was, well, if we pass on her due to culture fit, we need to add age to our rubric if we are not going to hire her. You're literally redefining our standards. So we need to maintain uniform standards. So we are going to have to add that assessment for all candidates. Look, so we hired her. And she wound up being a tremendous addition to the team. I think similar to your case, probably mid-50s. And if memory serves, she was really fun and wound up being a cultural touchstone to the group. There's the mentorship aspect, but I remember this particular candidate being like particularly fun. Like actually like outfunning people. So, the social and economic impacts on older, more vulnerable Americans, I take great pause before saying this because it is so astonishing that nearly half of Americans, 46% of Americans, do not have at least 3 months of savings on hand. And the loss of health benefits, pension contributions from employers, and social security contribution, and contributing to is people not taking care of themselves. This includes preventative treatments. Like the U.S. spends more on healthcare and has worse outcomes than comparable countries. For example, like we have the highest death rates for avoidable or treatable conditions. And I think this is an example of systemic issues So, such as the impact of eliminating, along with the privatization of pensions, thank you, Milton Friedman and trickle-down economics, where there's generational finger pointing and the associated division that comes along with it, where all parties are experiencing the downside of something they did not create. Younger generations feeling blocked from access to advancement and economic prosperity, and older folks expecting to live longer and therefore need more money for retirement. Our mutual friend Sam had started a financial tech company, a bank that served the needs of older folks, mostly retired. They did a lot of demographic research and polling, and they found that the baby boomers, who are and will probably be the richest generation of Americans, possibly ever, yet when they were polled about their financial state, they often talked about feeling poor, which, could be being raised by parents who experienced the Great Depression. But to get back on track here, folks are being left to their own devices to fend for themselves in an increasingly challenging environment. And there's this knowledge and experience drain that we're seeing in the U.S. workforce.
It doesn't feel to me, Katie, without getting too much into the political realm, and you and I have both worked in Europe and are aware of different models, but it doesn't really feel like we're setting people up for success, regardless of what generation that you're in. And going back to our episode on growth mindset, it's all up to the employees of whatever age to assess what's going on and figure it out. The safety net for Americans, especially older ones, and yes, I have compassion for the younger generation who is absolutely not being set up for success very unfairly. But some of these older Americans are possibly caring for both elderly parents and children. And there is an insufficient safety net. And if the trends we're talking about continue without intervention, we're going to start to see suffering at scale and a lot of I think negative impacts on individuals, families, communities, and even the U.S. labor market. When we come back, we're going to talk about what people and companies can do to combat ageism.
And we're back talking about what employees can do, what we can do. You should always be evaluating your professional options, including an exit strategy from your current employer, whether it's voluntary or not. Look at your emergency savings and have a plan. One of the things I think that has become increasingly common, but still is worth a shout out, is for folks, of course, you want to do your best by your current employer. You want to absolutely make your, the most outstanding contribution possible within your human parameters. But ultimately, the forcing function of putting people in the position where they are fending for themselves to really respond accordingly. And so be continuing to advocate for yourself and be looking for options and thinking really creatively about how to maximize your network. Another thing is saving and spending. So deciding on long-term implications of financial commitments, like making hard decisions. The first episode, we talked about spending, the treadmill, and the golden handcuffs. One of the things that winds up creating a tightening trap is that a lot of very intense financial commitments are entered into with, first of all, the assumption that earnings will remain the same, and second of all, not the full-on consideration of what it's going to look like if you are still managing that expense in 20 years. So thinking really carefully about everything that we take on and anything that we spend on, as far as the hard road becomes the easy road becomes the hard road. I don't want to be putting all of this responsibility on people, but just an encouragement about thinking about the financial commitments we make and putting more consciousness into them in terms of our values and what we want for our lives on the long-term sense. Constantly evaluating your technical and your functional skills relative to what's hot on the market. be aware that companies undervalue experience by like 5x, meaning they're happy to hire someone with 5 years experience compared to yours. Update your resume and LinkedIn at least once a year. Remove old jobs and skills. Like, for example, do not list Microsoft Office as a skill. Unfortunately, it is preferable to remove how many years experience along with graduation dates. Remove all jobs prior to like at least around 2004. It doesn't really mean anything anymore. This is something, it came up, I told a story about selling Prozac for Eli Lilly in an earlier episode, and someone had given me feedback to say, wow, that's a really dated story. And just to remember that for those of us who have longer career histories, you're like, I sold for Xerox and like knocked the cover off the ball. It's like, that is a meaningful part of your career, and I don't want to like undersell that. But thinking that your resume isn't like your sort of autobiography, that your resume is actually like making a case for the value that you can bring to the position at hand. And so part of that is being like, yeah, I can kind of recognize that you have built on those older skills. Like having sold Prozac, telling a story about that. And quite frankly, it was like, I was like, oh, that's like, because I was totally unaware of that. So look, many people start to better understand themselves later in life and decide for themselves that they want to leave their job or a career. Statistics show that this is actually a good time to make changes in your career. Rather than be miserable in a corporate job well into middle age, consider making a jump to align your interests and skills to opportunities where you may be in greater control of your destiny.
Oh, that's so inspiring. I think that's a really positive possible silver lining to all of this, which is on this show, we talk about the grind and the game and the hustle. And now we're talking about how the ladder doesn't, stops at a certain point, and you may kind of be kicked out a little bit, sort of up and out of the game. And maybe this is sobering and a little bit depressing, but maybe there's a silver lining in it, which is, hey, this is your time now. And maybe there's an opportunity to really shift gears and do something that you're going to like. I've spent a lot of time in my career around workforce management strategy. And, it's been well documented that we have significant skills shortages in the world. At the same time, we also have a reduction in many jobs that we know will become obsolete due to innovation like AI. And I think we are very, very aware that there are profound changes in how each generation is relating to work, whether it be the healthy boundaries that Gen Z demands, or boomers and Gen X staying in the workforce longer. I think trying to be positive here, in my mind, there's an opportunity for organizations here to think differently about employees. And I think the first is to make age part of your overall workforce strategy. Skills should be integrated with forecast planning, and all recruiting should be done in alignment with those plans. Now, I have seen where we have certain very rare skills where skills will be tracked because they're very precious, and there might be a technology that people just aren't learning anymore. But before an organization can sunset that technology, you still need those folks around. And so it's very precious, and you can track it down to the individual person. Skills-focused hiring may reduce the likelihood of prejudice. It will certainly help your existing employees understand the types of roles your organization will need in the coming years. So to what you just said, they can train up accordingly, right? It kind of helps them to, bridge to the next chapter. Speaking of which, organizations should train recruiters, senior leadership, and all hiring managers on generational considerations as part of your acquisition strategy. Take a page from the great work many are doing to support neurodivergent candidates and mirror this for other cohorts. Consider the age performance paradox, which says that while older Americans are undervalued during the recruiting process, the data shows that once hired, they perform generally the same, if not better, than their younger peers. And finally, add age to your DE&I programs. I was shocked to find that only 8% of companies include age in DE&I. As with gender, race, and sexual orientation, ensure age-related metrics are tracked across the employee lifecycle. Remember that knowledge and experience are precious commodities. And by the way, older Americans are also your customers and investors. So, Katie, this was a great show. I'm glad our audience suggested it.
Completely agree. And please keep the great feedback and the recommendations coming. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, and share with other psychos you know. We'd also love to hear from you, so hit us up on our socials. You can find us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook under @BusinessPsychosPod. Bye.